Just beginning by saying that linguistics, biology can have everything to do with decolonial endeavors. Everyone can contribute from any discipline and any practice. So I'm going to read. Before sharing a few main ideas on decolonizing museums and their collections, I must provide some context around the standpoint from which I've been thinking about these pressing issues for quite some time now. I'm an historian of modern and contemporary art, visual culture, exhibition histories, with practice-based experience, also as a curator of modern and contemporary art, as I've just said, most notably from Portuguese, so modern and contemporary art, most notably from Portuguese-speaking African and Afro-diasporic contexts. So my entry point into critically thinking about colonial legacies in museums often occurs through the perspective of a scholarly and curatorial attention to various decolonial strategies put forth by African contemporary visual artists and the several artistic institutions where they exhibit their work, including not only private and public museums, but also commercial galleries, and more or less militant, not-for-profit, grassroots, community-oriented, artist-run spaces. So it's a research that is very concerned with several kinds of institutions, museums for sure, but not only. As far as museums are concerned, I've often been thinking about the specific decolonial possibilities and limits, importantly, of modern and contemporary art museums, considering collection and exhibition histories across various periods and geographies. So not only, or perhaps not even mainly, ethnographic museums, but ethnography comes into place, and anthropology and so forth, and colonial histories. But institutionally, even and museologically, the entry point is quite often an attention to modern and contemporary art museums, which are a different kind of museum than this one that we are visiting today. But in connection, historically even, as I'm going to say as well. Specifically regarding ethnographic museums like the one we are visiting today, and as various decolonial endeavors undertaken in many other ethnographic museums testify, beyond the necessary involvement of African, Afro-diasporic and other communities at all stages of decolonial discussions, initiatives and decision-making processes, visual artists from such communities are often invited to critically reflect on enduring colonial legacies by making new artwork through access to ethnographic collections, by exhibiting artwork or performing in critical dialogue with ethnographic exhibitions, by leading art education initiatives with students from various backgrounds, etc. So contemporary African and Afro-diasporic artists are entering the ethnographic museums, are being invited, and sometimes are squatting and not being invited, but entering nonetheless. In Portugal, such interest in the decolonial critique afforded by contemporary art within ethnographic museums has recently increased those initiatives and that interest, on the part of the museum leadership itself. For instance, at the Natural History Museum and at the Ethnology Museum in Lisbon, among others, just to give recent examples. On the other hand, as a modern and contemporary art historian, I must also acknowledge the historical colonial links at the heart of the transdisciplinary historical proximity between the disciplines of anthropology and art history, notably, though not exclusively, regarding the canonical history of European modernism from the late 19th and especially the beginning of the 20th century onwards. Many of the looted objects that are now at the center of the international debate on restitutions and reparations are precisely those which, having been collected and exhibited by Western ethnographic museums in the wake of extractive colonial military expeditions and pseudoscientific missions, had become landmark sources of aesthetic, formal, and material inspiration for the so-called great masters of Western modernisms in places like Paris, London, and Berlin, but later also in Lisbon and Porto. The other often misinterpreted, miscontextualized, and anonymized authorial side of the white male canon of Western modernism has often been an African artistic, spiritual, either quotidian or ceremonial, complex, inventive, and heterogeneous material culture, whose modernity has always defied Eurocentric conceptions of tradition, and whose admired originality had to be anxiously restricted to the category of the ethnographic artifact. Valued by the West and copied by Western modernists, such so-called ethnographic material culture had to be anxiously relegated to another place. Inspiring and yet placed at a distance from the so-called truly original modern masterpiece, authored by the genius artistic subjectivity of the Western modern artist with a name. These critical ideas are important, but they are far from new. We all know this. And I've just been repeating out, well, I'm just reminding ourselves of these. These ideas are actually very old. Anthropologists, cultural theorists, and art historians like Jimmy Clifford, Rashid Areen, Oluwagibi, Hal Foster, just to name a few, have famously, very famously, called our attention with museological and curatorial examples to the historical and epistemic colonial complicities between Western anthropology and Western modern art history. To my mind, in line with the uncomfortable but mandatory radicality of scholars like Françoise Verger and Ariella Aisha Azoulay, truly confronting the colonial legacy of museums, whether ethnographic or modern and contemporary, requires not only ongoing bottom-up, grassroots and community-driven action and education, but also, and this is the thorny part, deeper, more complex, more difficult conversations on the ways in which the structural, broader colonial legacies of racial and patriarchal capitalism remain pervasive in society at large, and so they necessarily also sustain the actual governance of institutions such as museums and universities beneath the varnish of decolonial exhibitions, events, and publications. To fully decolonize such institutions, one will have to decolonize much more than them, to the extent that it will become necessary to truly democratize access to all levels of education and to all kinds of jobs, to decent housing and health for all, alongside other fundamental non-imperial rights, to quote from Azoulay. In Portugal, we still need to decolonize history textbooks and collect ethnic racial data to then be able to design reparatory public policies. We will have to make efforts not only towards diversifying collections and exhibitions and writing more rigorous histories, ethnographies, and art histories, but also seriously work towards returning not simply objects but also human remains with the care it requires, and Portuguese museums still hold them. Working towards critically addressing the kinds of corporations, sponsors, and donors that are funding our museums. Working towards truly fighting against labor precariousness in museums, universities, and beyond, attending to the situation of those who clean museums, those who prepare food in museums, those who guard museums. Not to mention, of course, being truly invested in equal representation in museum direction boards, boards of trustees, boards of acquisitions, and curatorial and programming leadership. So confronting the colonial legacy in museums will require a real ethical and political engagement, being fully aware of and coherently responsible for an anti-capitalist politics and the openness, and this is the difficult structural thing, and the openness to embrace the discomfort, particularly, I mean, we are all speaking from different subjective positionalities, and perhaps now also speaking more directly to questions pertaining to whiteness and critical whiteness, hopefully it will be necessary also to engage, to embrace the discomfort of this endless ongoing learning that quite often, for a few of us, can only occur through the pains of the discomfort of unlearning quite a lot. Unfortunately, to decolonize the museum, the curricula, the university, memory, public space, knowledge, has become quite an empty soundbite, a very necessary one, don't get me wrong, but also a quite empty soundbite at times. The latest theoretical, curatorial, fashionable trend, the ultimate neoliberal co-opting trap. How to remain committed without cynicism. How to remain critically vigilant and from one's own situated positionality, realistically as well as imaginatively aware of one's possible contribution to a struggle that can only be collective, bottom-up, both local and transnational, epistemic within and beyond academia, within and beyond the museum, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, and anti-capitalist. How far can we really go? At this juncture, I recall another old saying, and famous, but still important, I think. That famous juxtaposition by Antonio Gramsci, which Stuart Hall also kept repeating, as a hopeful action-oriented, political and epistemic compromise between reality and desire. Hall, quoting Gramsci, was always saying, "I'm the pessimistic of the intellect and the optimistic of the will." One must remain intellectually pessimistic for sake of that vigilance and permanent criticality. So intellectually pessimistic and willfully optimistic, so that the decolonization of museums and of so much more may indeed achieve what it promises. I'm just finishing. Hopeful and creative and finishing with redirecting again the focus towards the creative and the artistic contribution, but not only the theoretical as well, and the activist and the pedagogical, hopeful and creative imagination, above all the role of the imagination, I think. And I think we have seen examples here. Hopeful and creative imagination has been an invaluable critical tool for survival in the past, in many resistant pasts that cannot simply or easily be transposed into the present and the future, but which may indeed assist in inspiring and imagining anew. Strategies. How to devise, imagine the strategies. So there are archives of strategies from the past, but also quite often special kinds of archives. It has been the artists, the performers, the musicians, the poets, but also the theorists, the activists, the educators, many of whom women, many of whom never attending the university, hardly entering the museum, and so many neglected by canonical histories, by the archive. But quite often it has been these who have first imaginatively rehearsed the impossible into being. In past moments where some of the things we are doing today were desired as impossibles. And those impossibles became possible, or a little bit more possible. So although museums may be impossible to fully decolonize given that foundation, which is a colonial foundation, as Françoise Verger insists, she's always insisting, between the possibilities, which she never gives up on the possibilities, but at the same time acknowledging that the task, as far as the museum is concerned, might be an impossible one, given the history and also the structure, the capitalist structure. Because we decolonize a museum, but we get outside of the museum and we have the neoliberal university and the neoliberal this and that. So the way labor is organized and access, again, to those basic rights. We have just been facing, in the outskirts of Lisbon, scandalous examples of evictions that are racialized processes and that are also colonial legacies. So the invitation not to fragment the struggles is an important one, but also reminding one of the fact that what we are trying to do here today in the museum goes beyond the museum. So although museums may be impossible to fully decolonize, they may still be able to collaboratively, as we are doing now actually here, open up space for such inspiring past and present voices, past and present, voices that have been invisibilized, to be heard. at least the museum at least becoming a meeting place for as many as possible to imagine the impossible that we desire together.
I really struggle to think of what I would share with you today, but I hope I can speak for the 10 minutes. I just wanted to start by thanking Anna for what you just shared. I think one of the most difficult things in exploring questions of decolonization in museums is precisely what one of our former colleagues in the picture has called colonial aphasia, that the colonial is often constructed as something that exists at a distance, both in terms of time, a distant past, but also in terms of geography, a distant elsewhere. That the colonial is happening somewhere else, when the colonial is both foundational to where we are, but also in the present. As you said, the colonial is enduring, not just as a specific time period to which we return to try and understand the present, but the colonial also as the making of the future. So I wanted, in my attempt to, butcher Portuguese, to share some words that were sort of, I thought to be key in the attempt to articulate something about the decolonial, and this is just sort of provocation. Please do the correct pronunciation to help me. Now, the words that I came to my mind, and I was thinking, why is this important? This question of the decolonial option, as a lot of the decolonial scholars recognize, the decolonial is one option amongst many on how to confront not just the legacies of the colonial, but the colonial in the present. So the first was, please say this correctly because I'm going to butcher it. The first one is conhecimentos. 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 Knowledge, exactly. The first is, of course, thinking about knowledge, but the multiplicity of knowledges. Why is it important to think about the decolonial as an option? Of course, is to rupture the foundation of a linear understanding of the world. Europe has never been the center of the world. The museum is not the center of understanding the multiplicity of these histories, but it's an important option. So the first word for me was down. The second one was reflexão.
Very well.
Reflexão. Yeah, the second one was reflection. It was about this work and the labor is something that, as you rightly pointed out, is not going to happen as quickly or as fruitfully as we might want it to. And part of this reflection is not just on the task of confronting the colonial, but it's actually reflecting on, I don't want to say this positionality in a sense, but it's reflecting on what exists beyond the limits of what we've been made to understand as possible. To say, well, maybe actually the decolonial option is one of the minutest tasks in trying to actually collapse a project which doesn't just make it impossible to understand the multiple histories in the museum, but makes it impossible to inhabit a shared planet. So this project of the colonial that we inhabit in the present is responsible for the decimation of millions of lives in the present. And to understand this project in the museum is to try and understand how the colonial is responsible for the construction of disposable life. That the material that we encounter in the museum is just a microcosm, not just of forms of historical destruction and theft, but of a much bigger planetary project that continues to churn and to take away. And it's not just taking objects, it's taking away the ability to exist. So I think this reflexão is an important one. The third word that I thought of is humildade.
Humility,
Yes. And I think for me, it was more about the importance of recognizing one's contribution, not as messianic. I mean, a lot of people who approach work in these different spaces might present it as if they have answers. And as you also rightfully pointed out, a lot of them are questions to which we are trying to find responses. But the humility here, especially in the work that I was doing in Oxford in the last 3.5 years, and with a lot of European and African partners, is the humility to recognize that actually, in many ways, some places will not be capable of decolonizing themselves. The task of the decolonial is maybe something that some people have to be humble enough to say, actually, maybe we are not the people who are going to be able to do this decolonial work. Not because you're not able to, but because the task of, in my language in Shona, we say if you've been bewitched, you need a process of detoxification. You get a healer that comes and makes you throw up all the things that you have apparently been bewitched with. And before you have gone through that detoxification, you can't actually recognize yourself because you've been bewitched. And in a lot of the work that we were doing, there's a lot of anthropological work on witchcraft. The witchcraft is elsewhere, but the witchcraft is Europe. It is in Europe. And a lot of it is the hubris to imagine that the people who lead and do the work of decolonizing are here. But maybe they're not. So I was thinking of this humility. I thought the two last words that I was going to just share, that I was thinking about in this, is the intersection of, you say, historia and futuro. And I was thinking about this contradiction that also occurs in the focus on the colonial, and how the colonial sometimes might become this sort of Faraday cage, where when we focus on the colonial, it's as if that focus is going to produce a result. When parts of the focus on the colonial is the question of how not to reproduce particular kinds of relations into the future, which is to say, what particular kinds of labor are necessary to build a future that's not the same as the dominant histories that we're trying to confront. For me, that has been one of the most complicated spaces to maneuver, because you have conversations, for instance, on the African continent with a lot of colleagues who say we're tired of this colonial because we are more than the colonial moment. The colonial moment doesn't inaugurate the lives of these people. But the question then is, how do you navigate the space of both confronting the colonial but gesturing towards a much more generative and productive future that doesn't keep people in this space in which they are defined primarily by their encounter with the colonial. So those two words for me is, how do you begin to work towards future orientation to say, so what's to come? Which in very similar ways is what you're talking about, the creative approaches to say. And I always say, so just before I always say, when we have these conversations, that Africans have always made the world, just like many indigenous peoples in many other parts of the planet. It's not as if Africans began making the world in their encounter with the colonial. And it's not as if the material encounter in the museum is the totality of the making of those people. They continue to make in the present. So how do you bring those worlds in? Thank you so much.
So I started writing and thinking a lot about the collector as a traveler, and also the researcher as a traveler, and what's the importance of the travel and all of this. And as this exhibition is one of, at least from what I know, one of the recent ones that is most focused on provenance research, I thought that what I'm going to say is maybe worth saying here. So I'm going to read. I'm going to read because I prepared some text. Today I propose examining the role of collectors in establishing museum collections. Building on my doctoral research, I will focus on Victor Bandeira, the primary collector at the National Museum of Ethnology, formerly the Overseas Ethnology Museum. This project, so the museum, began in the early 1960s, intending to represent the cultures of Portuguese overseas territories alongside those found in metropolitan Portugal. Between 1960 and 1990s, Bandeira collected items from Africa, Asia, and Latin America for the museum collection. I hold Victor Bandeira in high esteem, even though I recognize the controversial nature of his acquisitions after meeting him. I first met him in 2021 at his home in Costa da Caparica. After a year of research at the museum, I realized that the most objects in the Guinea-Bissau collection that I was studying for my PhD had been acquired by him. Contrary to my expectations, when I arrived at his house, I found it practically bare of objects. Once I arrived, he asked me to take off my shoes when I entered and led me into the living room. It was a rectangular room with large rugs and cushions, large windows, but no sofas. We sat down on the floor. I remember admiring Vitor's ability to cross his legs and sit with his back straight despite his advanced age. He was wearing comfortable clothes and offered me a glass of chilled white wine. We started chatting. He told me he had started studying at the Fine Arts Society, but had given up shortly afterwards to open an antique shop with a friend. While running that business, he traveled to the major European capitals and received catalogs from international auction houses. It was through this that he became aware of the growing appreciation of African art in the art market in the late 1950s, inspiring him to make his first trip to Africa. He sold the antique shop and freed himself from any possessions in Lisbon before making his big trip by jeep from Lisbon to Ivory Coast. During this first trip, between 1960 and 1961, he purchased numerous objects, which he then exhibited at the Porto School of Fine Arts upon his return to Portugal. Members of the organizing committee of the Portuguese Overseas Museum visited this exhibition and convinced him to sell the collection of objects, making him an informal collaborator of the institution. Informal in quotes. From that point on, Bandeira traveled to various locations, acquiring objects to enrich the museum collections. The way in which he did this is questionable, but what I want to focus. But that is not what I want to focus in this reflection. Bandeira had been traveling since he was a teenager. When I asked him about it, he told me that this was not his first big trip. By the age of 30, he had already lived in Greece and had only spent short periods in Portugal. For him, traveling was a way to experience different ways of life and, as he put it, to be other, in quotes again, reinventing and recreating himself in the process. In Guinea-Bissau, the region I studied in more detail, he told me that he had lived with local people, witnessed initiation rituals, and had been undergone initiation himself to find a sense of belonging within the community. He lived in villages for months, sharing daily lives and meals. He slept on people's balconies, and said this created a connection with the population that enabled him to acquire the objects. Is this true? We will never know. This testimony was reinforced in 2022 when the following year I spoke to him in the storage of the Museum of Ethnology. Victor was a spiritual person with tender eyes, difficult to understand. He always wore a yin-yang symbol on his lapel. He spoke about the artifacts with affection. Even after so many years, he knew their stories. He said he bought them not for their function, but for their beauty. I think that's what Victor was looking for, beauty in life. So this is quite controversial, the text time maybe, but this is the story of Victor. And now I would like to share 2 videos. I chose these 2 short clips to comparison, just because on one hand in the National Ethnology Museum in Lisbon, we don't have, so we have the object, but we don't have the meaning of the object. Because when they were collecting inspired mostly by the European art modernism and this very aesthetic criterias. And then once you arrive to Guinea, you have, I don't know if you could follow, but a multiplicity of meanings associated to these objects, and that are of course really connected to protection of the communities, protection of the villages, somehow some kind of poderes adivinhatórios, divinatory powers, yeah. So yes, so this is also for you not to get the impression that I'm against restitution. I'm not against restitution or at all, but I like to create this kind of soups in which I navigate just to try to understand which are the threads I want to pull for me at certain points, and in this, of course, they want the objects to come back, but they realize they need a proper museum. This is the museum how it is right now. They don't have a museum at the moment, so they want reparation to be done firstly economically, so that they are allowed to have or they are capable of having a museum, because nowadays they were evicted from the museum they used to have by the national government, and the objects are at the Cinema Institute. They are just stored there without any conditions. So yeah, so they have all the knowledge, they have some objects, but the objects are, as you can see here, and they don't have a proper exhibition room, and yeah. So that's why I thought it was important to go there and to do all this research, also to so to have this collaboration, this proper collaboration. Yeah. So in the end, I don't know what it will be.
I can ask the first question about the question of violence. You mentioned in the beginning that you have this photograph of, in this, I don't know, in Angola. Is it in Angola?
Yes.
You have this military and these objects and so on. And you mentioned that Anthropology Museum in Lisbon, they repress access to the archives and to the storages, and any research on how much violence is involved in the constitution of that collection. As a non-expert in this museum and the colonial matters, I am a bit surprised that this is an issue, because if there is violence, of course you should exhibit, you should show it. Because on the other hand, in history, normal history, social, political history, we know that Lisbon was taken to the Moros through violence. We know that the muezzin was violently killed. We know that the Moros, the Islamic people in Portugal, were expelled from Portugal in 1497. The Jews were forcibly converted to Christianism. They were not expelled. Okay, we know this. This is part of the history. So, what's the big problem of course, I understand that the gaze that was for a long time constituted about these objects was about their beauty, the diversity of cultures of the world. It was very much aesthetic and so on. So maybe the museum for a long time has repressed it. But if you look at the political history, Algarve was conquered also. So what's the big thing about saying that there is violence involved, but maybe and eventually not violence involved, not in all objects or some of these objects. So I don't see, as a newcomer, I don't see what's the big deal here.
Someone would like to comment?
We know about the destruction of European Jews during the Holocaust. We now are seeing the destruction of the Palestinians in Gaza.
So I don't know if someone wants to comment on this issue. Well, humankind is about violence, no?
Yeah.
Our history is about violence. So that's a very pertinent comment. Why shouldn't we talk about it?
Yeah.
Why shouldn't we explain that certain collections are in museum because of violence? As a result of violence means, yes, that's what we researchers question ourselves. In our university, for example, we had this case of a student who went to the National Ethnographic Museum, and she had a conversation with the director and asked to study one specific collection from Brazil, and she intended to think and to reflect on restitution. And from the moment that she said this word, the director sent her back, and she was not allowed to do the research she wanted. So that's our question here. It's we debate ourselves with that.
May I ask something with the answers? Was it the current and recent leadership? Was it the current director?
No. It was before the current. Yes, we have a new director now in the National Ethnographic Museum. This was before.
Yes. I mean, this is a very important museum regarding this conversation we are having, the National Ethnology Museum. And its history is a very complex history as well. As Elizabeth was saying, and in the context of Anna's presentation, the collections are very much marked by all sorts of expeditions and dislocations, complex traveling in the framework of the colonial war / war of liberation and so forth. But it's true that the current, very recent leadership, very, very recent, seems to apparently is signaling to society and to academia and to the artistic, including the contemporary art circuit, slightly more openness. It's very recent thing. We are still trying to understand. There seems to be a generational thing going on in recent general changes actually in several museums, national museums. There were competitions for leaderships late last year, so this is a very, very recent change. And I have to say, I don't know, from what I've been observing, also including academia, I'm always bringing it back because I think there are parallels. I think the decolonial debate here in Portugal, which is very delayed, which is still very fraught with lots of Estado Novo legacies as well, not only colonial but Estado Novo, the dictatorship period that only ended in 74, and regarding all sorts of structures and mentalities, it obviously did not end in 74. So now I think there is this generational thing that might open possibilities from only now onwards. Regarding certain museum leaderships, but it's true what Elizabeth, I also know from experience of very close, from peers, including artistic peers, who wanted to delve into the collections to do artistic work, that it was, with the two previous leaderships, it was, we do not have this conversation. Now I have to say I'm surprised and a little bit more hopeful with this very younger, apparently more open, very recent director, who invited, currently you can visit right now only one because the second has finished, but there were, like last month you could still visit 2 temporary exhibitions, and the question of restitution applies mostly to the permanent, and there are issues of restitution in place for sure. But there were 2 temporary that would have been impossible with the previous leadership, regarding the violent nature of our colonial histories, curated by Professor Isabel Castro Henriques and Professor Inocência Mato, with a huge team, a very diverse team of historians and anthropologists contributing, and also an invitation from the museum for the contemporary art collection of the state, of the Portuguese state, to enter the museum with critical contributions on colonial history by contemporary artists. As, not so long in terms of the amount of time that you could actually be available to visit, so it has ended this second one. So this just to say that there are, but going back to violence, I mean, this is a very complex question. My comment is just going to be very brief, but there is lots of literature on lots of different dimensions of violence, and I think that what Alexandra was trying to say regarding the decision not to expose certain photographs is the problem of reenacting violence, precisely as you hinted, through the gaze, the issue of the gaze and the question of symbolic violence and representational violence, which is a problem beyond military violence or genocidal violence. The question of representation, whether in text, whether in image, whether in moving image, is also a question of violence. And I'll suggest this.
I was just going to quickly say, we had this whole conversation in Oxford in November, with some of our colleagues from South Africa, and we reflected on what it is meant to exhibit anti-black violence, and of course the histories of, the violence inflicted on black people on the continent and in diaspora. So one of the photographs that's very famous, that has been used for instance, by Tina Camp, listening to images, is the image of this African man who's, whipped and has all these welts on his back, which is circulated a lot. And parallel to that, for instance, was the willingness of Emmett Till's mother in the US, when Emmett Till was murdered, to have his photograph taken to show what had been done to his body by these racists. And I think there's a level and the multiple layers through which you can engage a violent history or present without necessarily reproducing a history of a scopophilic gaze. There is in sometimes in audiences a desire that is produced in seeing violence, which is not in itself a resolution to the history of the violence. I think there's a again, it's like that line to say, what do you show and what does it do in engaging? So for instance, when you visit the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, it's not the bodies and the images of the people who are strewn or who are being in many ways murdered. It's a very specific memorialization of the violence that you encounter. And I think we recognize in very specific ways whose bodies are much more likely to be displayed to make the violence more palpable. So if we say, oh, people are dying in the Mediterranean Sea, do you need to see the image of the child who drowned for you to understand the gravity of the situation? And there's that sort of, so if, for instance, we recognize that historically certain people have always been on display in zoos,
Yes.
on slave markets, and on these colonial photographs, do we want to turn the museum space into that sort of scopophilic space? Maybe not. But I agree with that. I think there's a question of how you actually engage the violence. You shouldn't hide it, but I think you should also turn it into some sort of fair, which unfortunately in a museum space you have to. Let me just quickly to give you one example of something that I struggle with. In maybe 18, 19, in London, a big fire unfortunately led to the death of a lot of people. It's known as Grenfell. And of course this was a direct result of state abandonment and neglect. One of the best definitions of racism is given by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. That racism is how people are made more amenable to premature death and disposability. Now, one of the people who died in that fire was a Gambian heritage artist whose work had shown in Venice. Now, some of her photographs sit in the Pictures Museum now. And the Pictures has acquired these photographs. That's very fascinating that this work is existing in this space in the aftermath of the death of this person, which was very public. But she died because of state abandonment. The conversation around that abandonment is not there. But they say, oh look, we acquired this photo. So this is a fascinating way institutions try to make violence absent. But not necessarily by not displaying the violence, but by doing other sort of, slight of it. So anyway, it's a different area.
Two small points. If you are a cinema director, and if you want like Alain Resnais about the Jewish Holocaust, he shows it all.
Yes.
Or of course, Claude Lanzmann about Shoah, he won't show anything, it's just about talk, blah, 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 blah. But many other cinema directors show it.
Yes.
And there is not a big discussion among cinema directors or documentary about what you can show you or what you cannot show.
Yes.
It's a personal decision.
Yes.
About violence, for instance, in Portugal, we have the archive of the Inquisition. And if you are an historian, if you are a researcher, you can access it.
Yes.
And you write your book freely about what you want to say. So there is not. I understand that the museum has repressed for a long time. So now this process of bringing back and I'm not saying that you have to show it all. You have to make decisions. You take the responsibility. You have to make. You have to ponder or to ponder aspects, legal, moral, ethic, whatever, But it should not be a big thing, Because in cinema there is not this big thing. If you are an historian, you want to talk about the Inquisition, there is not this big thing. You research and you write your book, and that's it. But I understand that maybe the museum is different. I am a curator. I have exhibited Ariel Azoulay in Lisbon. I wanted to do it.
In arquivo fotográfico.
Sim.
Yes. I've seen.
She says what she has to say. I didn't have any problems. No one has been bothering me about that. Just as I wanted to breaking the
But
silence.
she's the most aware, self-aware and vigilant practitioner,
Yes,
curator
but
and theorist
I'm-
as far as
Okay,
the danger of
I'm doing
representation
curation,
of
but I
violence
don't
is
have
concerned.
a training in curatorial studies, so all these concerns are not my concerns.
I just think that regarding certain shared pasts and shared memories, I think it's important to have the conversation and maybe make those decisions. You have given individual authorial examples of individual directors who have decided a certain way, but I think maybe a way forward, maybe in a decolonial sense, ethically regarding that issue and other related issues might be precisely to foster a practice of a more collective decision making, so that you take more sensibilities into account, because you are saying very straightforwardly, to my mind there is no problem, but maybe others will feel other way, notably that it's something that has come into the discussion also locally in some initiatives regarding Afro-diasporic communities and colonial memory and violence, which is, for example, another example, the exhibition that has been recently curated at the Padrão dos Descobrimentos around the black presence in the outskirts of Lisbon, in the segregated outskirts of Lisbon from the revolution onwards, curated by Professor Inocência Mata e Filipe Lange Vicente, a recent initiative. There was a care to bring in and to listen. It was a photographic exhibition, so all the ethical aspects of photography came into play. How to, be careful of not aestheticizing poverty, issues of all sorts of ethical issues. And there was the conversation. So I think that could be a way, to a strategy of deciding together and listening to the descendants of certain communities. Again, this idea of the bottom up, and the conversation to make certain decisions.
Here our goal was, we decided not to expose violence, and we also decided to, we worked a lot with the ancient labels, the museum, the historic labels of the museum, where we can find racist and Eurocentric language. And we thought a lot about that, and we reflected, we talked with Lennon and talked with other colleagues, and our option was related to the fact that people are visiting this museum without being guided to it. So if children comes in and reads in the entry of the exhibition racist expressions, Eurocentric expressions, and she will have the notion that this is correct. The museum is still is a place of authority. So this could open this mean of. I'm sorry, I could not express myself really, as well as I do in Portuguese, but the question was, for us, was that we don't have guided tours here, so we will make this option. We thought a lot about it, and that's what we decided.
I mean, not to take too much space on this question. I mean, it's a big question.
Yeah,
It's a question we live with. I mean, of course, decisions that we made, for instance, the picture is to take off the heads, that were on display, and the trophies of, for instance, Zimbabwean resistance fighters in British Museum. There are a lot of African ancestors that have been on display historically. And the question is, of course, there's violence. do we want to use other people's pain for entertainment?
Yes.
And we want to get into a museum and say, well, this is leisure activity. When we come into the museum, for tourists and so, this is what we want to say. Oh yeah, and I think part of the danger, especially when it comes to African people, Black people in general, like in diaspora, is a very static image of what constitutes the Black experience. So for instance, you go to Belgium, you go to the African Museum, which does something very, very strange. And then you see like a show that's on at the moment when we see us, by the Lake Koyo and Tanzania Lakama was now in Toronto, which gives a much more expansive experience of Blackness. These are two different spaces that are trying to claim something about being Black in the world. One does a very staid historical thing, which, in many ways is now passé. It's in the past, and it will go. And the other is trying to look at something which is forward-looking, to say, how do you bring the experiences of Black people that are more generous, that are more, not just positive or complex. But I don't want to see images of police violence and brutality, even though I know it happens. I don't want to be reminded every day. Christine Sharp, has a section in her last book, Ordinary Notes, where she talks about how Claudia King, the poet, has a talk where she shows specific images of police violence. And as an African American woman, she talks about her own former boyfriend who was murdered by the police, that they'd gone together at Howard. And she reflects on what it means as a Black person who has intimate knowledge of this violence, to constantly be reminded of that violence in these different spaces, as if there's no other way of engaging. I think there's as you say, it's important to engage, but also it's important to have a range of sensibilities that shape how we, and there's so much, I think, other work that tries to share that violence in more dignified and life-giving ways.
I think as well, when it comes to visual representation of violence against non-Native people, you have to consider the fact that colonial history created imagery to reinforce dominance. So, what's a good example? Over there, coercion and violence in the formation of collections. So, I think honestly for this exhibition, so for this exhibition, language is good because of the fact that you see the items and you have the words, but if you have the images that were taken by the colonizers, what ends up happening is it reinforces the narrative that they tried to push for centuries of with white dominance or Eurocentric dominance. So you don't want to keep reinforcing that. So by having the words and the collections rather than the collections and the imagery. Yeah, exactly. So that's the difference. If you don't, because the problem is you also have trauma porn. So you have trauma porn and then you have reinforcement of colonial dominance. I think this is a good balance. Sorry, I'm really dry because it's really hot. So forgive me. And that's where you don't want to tread into it. And I think the difference between the Holocaust and whatnot is when you have a narrative where, if you look at the globe overall and you have a set of people, melanated people, basically, what ends up happening is we keep pushing that narrative of minorities. You keep reinforcing that dominance and showing people in a position where they're subdued. It's not the best way to deconstruct colonization, and it's not the best way to deconstruct the systemic racism. Because in museums you can have systemic racism through the display of colonial dominance as well. So it's about that fine line, basically, and that's why it's not good to show the violence. I think it's better in words because of the fact that your imagination can take you where it wants to. And then if you want to know a little more about it, you can do that. But it also respects other people who come to see the exhibition, maybe people who don't want to relive the violence. Because what it is, it's like what do you call it? It's like re-traumatization. So I think that's the key thing. It's really like a fine line, and it's about emotional intelligence and not like pussyfooting or like stepping around it. It's just about finding that balance to where it's respectful but educational at the same time. And that's really where you start to move towards, I guess you could say, like a more appropriate version of decolonization and explanation of violent past of Portuguese colonization or like Dutch colonization or British colonization, anything like that. It's still acknowledgement, it's just not the subconscious reinforcement of colonial dominance, even in the 21st century. So it's that type of thing. Because like colonialism may have changed forms in terms of violence, but it's not just always physical violence. Like violence comes in many forms. So you have like violence is still going on today. You have financial violence, where people don't, necessarily get the opportunity to, I guess you could say, curate. I'm not familiar with museums. I'm an interculturalist, so basically I deal with intercultural studies. But like you could have a situation where like people don't get the opportunity to actually be involved in these type of processes. And that can also be a form of colonialization by not actually having the voices of, like, the cultures that created these in the space, or in, I guess you could say, in the creation of the exhibition. And that's what you have to think about when it comes to visuals. You have to be really careful with visuals when it comes to this type of stuff. That makes sense.
We had an exhibition in Padrão dos Descobrimentos. Well, I don't remember the name, but it was curated by some colleagues from the University of Coimbra, Miguel Bandeira Jerónimo. I don't remember the name of the exhibition, but it was all about violent pictures. And the option and the curator's option was expose the violence so that people were aware of what happened. So I think this discussion goes on and on, and it is, well, there are options, and here we thought this was the best, given the conditions we had to the access to the exhibition. Other questions?
Well, I was just thinking of the back of the conversation here. There's sort of two issues being discussed here. One around whether museums should display histories of violence and how. But then there's, going back to your question around the why museums seem so nervous to acknowledge the violence that has happened, and particularly colonial violence. And I don't have any answer to that question, but I think it's not specific to the Portuguese context. It's everywhere, obviously. Yeah, I don't know really where I want to go with that point, but it's an interesting question to think about. Why is it that museums are so sensitive, and maybe, what is it that underlies the willingness to display much older histories of violence, or where it seems there's a sort of distance, and when it's sort of more recent, there seems to be more nervousness. It would be interesting to know why.
Can I add a historian's perspective in that? I'm just thinking out loud here. Well, I think the issue with 19th and early 20th century colonial violence is that it was tied to processes of national, building national identities, and the nation states were being formed in that era. So it was a matter of who are we, and so that colonial violence was justified in terms of progress, in terms of science, in terms of a civilizational mission. So if you're now trying to face it, then perhaps that brings the question of, are we not so civil? I think there's a sensibility there that people don't want to
undermining
face
your
that question.
sense of self,
Because,
sense of nation.
and in terms of 19th century scientific expeditions in Africa, for example, up until the latter half of the 20th century, these explorers were still being hailed as national heroes. So that's deep-rooted in national identity. So I think that might contribute to why museums don't, perhaps are a bit more sensitive to letting historians go there and maybe ask that question of, were we not so civil then?
Yes, I just want to add on Anderson, because I was thinking the same, what you were saying, why do they do this? That's what you were asking, right? Why do museums, and I was thinking about it, and I was thinking like, okay, maybe that's what they know how to do, right? Because that's it, because violence is how you know how to talk about these others, right? Because if we address this as a point also, when we bring this national identity thing, would we talk about this violence like that? If we go to detect this, because if we talk about this colonialism through also with Estado Novo, with the Portuguese dictatorship, how would we, if we put these things, if we bring that to here, if we bring the question of national identity in this room, then how would we portray that? And I think in this sense, these images wouldn't come up, right? Because we don't talk about ourselves like that, right? We don't show our grandparents harmed, right? And I think maybe it would be interesting if, as museum practitioners that we start to look about about this question of national identities and ourselves in these histories, but also do it with other partners that also look at this in other ways. In a way also what Lennon was saying, that there's much more about than the colonial, right? So yeah, I think that space would be interesting, but sorry, I went a bit in the mayonnaise, but I was thinking what you said, and Anderson, I was like, okay, that's what they know how to do, right? Because that's how we talk about others. That's easy, right?
And I think in that sense, that's why also it's a little bit different than the Inquisition or the Reconquest, because that was justified in the name of Christianity, which was still and is still a core value. So maybe that's something that you can let go, because the question of were we not so Christian is not a question, but the question of were we not so civil then?
Yeah, it's also a long time ago.
Yeah, and it's further back
That
in the
also
past,
helps.
right?
I was just going to say, this violence is going on. It needs to say, the other way of thinking about this, was said very well by the director of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe in Iran. He said museums are already enshrined to colonial violence. Before you even think about, how are they saying this? The material they have, as they are, before you even name it, they exist as shrines to different forms of colonial violence. So the question of why they're sensitive about displaying things is really about who is encountering the material in the museum. All the people of African heritage I worked with who came into the picture, the moment they walked in, before they even know what's there, just by walking in, they felt the enormity of what's present. And then of course they look at what's there and it's just overwhelming. So the question is not for me whether museums can display, because they're already displaying colonial violence. The question is more, how do you, in a sense, like what Dominic says, reveal that museums have always functioned as durational devices that keep particular forms of time in place. And if you display the images of violence on African people, for instance, in our work, you are utilizing the function of the museum as a durational device. You're holding a specific moment in time, in place, and saying, this is how we know these people. Dan says very well, we blasted you into the past, and you are in that past. And so we display you in there.
Yeah, and I just visited Pitt Rivers last month. I was in London and I went there. And something that surprised me that I didn't remember, I went there before also, was that so in the showcases, the showcases are still like weapons, vocative objects, textiles, they are not, so this is, it's a museum that is completely crystallized in time.
In Victorian, because it's evolution. It was about saying, we're better.
Yeah.
Everyone else is in the past.
And the modern museums are a product of 19th century, so of this whole context and the schools of making the schools about the others and saying that we're better.
I am very interested in a collective that I can say it openly. I will be looking forward to curate one of their exhibition, which is forensic architecture. The collective from London.
Yes.
And now, for instance, they have in their website, which is a very good website, they have this research on the genocide of the Naman and the Herero in Namibia. I don't think that they are repressing anything about showing the violence that was done to those. But they even show the photographs, the videos, everything, the forensic expertises, and they put the local people talking, and they have. I think they have addressed many of those concerns that you have indicated, but that does not refrain them from showing the violence because they show it. I have curated an exhibition, forensic architecture, at the National Theatre in Lisbon. It was about the destruction of two villages of the Negev desert, the Bedouins, the Palestinians, Bedouins, and you see the violence, the destruction of their homes, how many people are killed, when they were shot, etc., etc., etc. So I understand your concerns, but then there is a decision to be made, and you have to have some artistic, even sensibility to do it. I am all for forensic architecture. I am, when I met Eyal Weizmann for the first time, I did not say that I was an admirator of him. I was jealous of him, because for me it's even bigger than admirator. So I have no problem with exhibiting violence. That's in fact as in my field of activity, which is this colonial enterprise in Israel, you have to show it. That's what I stand for. But I understand that the museum, maybe for these reasons that you indicate, or for the fact that you have for too long repressed it, now it's taking time to come there. But I also understand your concerns. You have to work and to address those concerns. But I personally think that you should show violence.
Maybe we ask if there's more questions and to finish because it's been already.
Okay. Yeah. Of course. Is there any other question? Just a final comment that I was thinking about the Portuguese colonial wars ended at 1974. So people are still who participated in these campaigns are still alive, and they don't. Well, I can tell you that that my father was one of them, and he was a boy that didn't even know, he didn't know how to read or to write, and he was sent to Africa when he was 18 with a goal. And I think one of the reasons why Portugal is so close to discuss these questions, I think, could be related to this situation.
Yes, the question of the temporality of several kinds of traumas on all sorts of sides. Yes, for sure. Our decolonization here in Portugal, I mean, in political terms, is very recent. So, of course, and many people are still alive. But I'd just like to make a very, very final comment on this issue. It's very interesting the weight that violence gained through mediality and visuality. And this is a fundamental question, I think, and it is an open question of the decolonial debate, very important ethically, politically, at all levels. And the heart of the matter, I would say, the heart of the matter. And it's important to denounce. It's important to denounce, not to hide. But the thing is, the opposite of denouncing, according to what Lennon was articulating, in you as well, very well, so I don't know your name. The opposite of this denunciation is not hiding. It's some sort of care, respect, restoring dignity, listening. But thank you for bringing, because I think it's a fundamental part of the conversations.
So thank you, Lennon. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna. And thank you all for being here and to make this reflection so interesting.